Hello, I'm back home. I hope you enjoyed the vlogs of the Netherlands, and now I'm recovering from that trip before heading back to work at CMAC and back to previously scheduled nerdy camera technology content. Today, I wanted to talk about the Canon R7. This is my brother's. I borrowed it from him. You may have seen the video where he came over and kind of shared his initial thoughts of owning it for about a week. I got to borrow it and use it on another production, and I have some thoughts getting to use it for an actual production, and I wanted to compare it to the original Canon EOS R. That was a question I got in that last video, and I want to share my thoughts as to if I think the R or the R7 is the way to go, and maybe kind of talk about why you would get one over the other depending on what you do. Let's briefly dive in. I'm sure if you're interested in these cameras, you've already seen tons of specs about it, but let me just briefly kind of overview some of the specs. Now, Canon R, the very first RF mount camera, Canon's first full frame mirrorless camera. They did have mirrorless cameras in the EOS M system. This is the first full frame one. The R is the first RF mount camera that is not full frame. It is an APS-C sensor. As of the recording of this video, the Canon EOS R costs about $17.99, but it often goes on sale, bringing it down to about the same price as the EOS R7, which is $14.99 for just the camera. Now, my brother Brandon got it with this kit lens, the 18-150, which is an amazing kit lens. I kind of just want to get this lens and put it on my C70. Now, if you're comparing the R7 to the EOS R with kit lenses, this is $18.99, and the EOS R with a 24-105 kit lens is like $2,099. So technically the price is pretty close. This one isn't currently on sale, but it does go on sale a lot, bringing it in line with the price of the newer R7. So yes, this one is still more expensive, but it is full frame. I know people who say they will not buy a camera with a sensor smaller than full frame. I'm not that picky. I think APS-C, there's a great place for it, especially if you want versatile yet compact lenses. There are more options in that realm. And also, I primarily do video, and there are a number of lenses that are Super 35 only. And if I put it on a full frame camera, I'm going to need to crop it in anyway. So for using all of my lenses, there's no real issue with Super 35 or APS-C for me. The next data point is that these cameras are about the same megapixels, with the EOS R being 30.3 megapixels and the R7 being 32.5. So theoretically, we have the same megapixels, but on a smaller surface area. So the R7 will be a little less light sensitive than the R, but it's not completely apples to oranges. There's things happening in the processing pipeline that are going to kind of even things out, I think, across these two cameras. So speaking of sensitivity, the EOS R goes from ISO 100, and I think you can lower it down to 50, but that's kind of like an artificial. I typically don't go lower than 100, all the way up to 102,400 ISO, which is really, really high, really, really sensitive. And of course, you're pumping voltage onto the sensor. Images at that ISO are not clean at all, and noise reduction doesn't really help. I try not to go over 12,800 on this camera. It really struggles beyond that, especially for stills. For video, even more so. For the R7, it goes from 100 to 51,200 ISO, which is only just one step below the EOS R, but once again, up in those high ISO ranges, you're not gonna really get a usable image. I haven't spent as much time with this. I haven't really taken a lot of photos at 12,800 ISO. I might not even recommend that high. The more we use it. It's quite a bit tougher with it being a smaller sensor and the pixel pitch being that much smaller, like 1.6 times, 1.7 times smaller. The first thing where I think this camera really starts to take off over the EOS R is the shutter speeds. Both cameras start at about 30-second exposure, and the EOS R can go up to 1/8,000th of a second, but the R7 can go up to 1/16,000th of a second. So it can even half the fastest shutter speed of the EOS R. So really, really fast motion. That is an electronic shutter, but if you really need to freeze something in motion, this would be the one to do it. The next spec that the R7 beats the R is the continuous shooting. The R7 can do up to 30 frames per second in electronic shutter, whereas the R can only do 8 on mechanical shutter, possibly also electronic shutter. It's not that fast. So if you need to crank out a bunch of pictures real quick, the R7 is going to be the one to do it. The R, though, still has a better EVF and LCD. So if you really care about the pixel density of your EVF and your LCD, this is the one to do it. It's a 3.69 million dot EVF and a 2.1 million dot LCD. This has been one of the best EVFs and LCDs that I've ever used until I got the R5C. But the R7 only has a 2.36 million dot EVF and a 1.62 million dot LCD. It's not bad though. Having used it on this production, I knew when I was in focus and out of focus. It didn't ever really let me down, but I just know as soon as I pick up this camera, it looks a lot more detailed on this camera. Autofocus wise, both of these cameras are great. The R has Canon's excellent dual pixel autofocus, and it's great. I rely on it for video, I rely on it for photos. It has rarely let me down unless I am trying to push to the extremes in a very dark situation. But the R7 gets a lot of the AF functionality from the R3. So it adds animal eye detection and vehicle detection, and it is insanely fast. It even impressed some of my friends. If you check out the latest episode of Unusable, it even blew Gilbert away. Now let's jump into some video stats, and this is where I think the R7 also really pulls ahead. The R has been a workhorse camera for me in both 1080 and 4K recording. The 1080 out of the camera is good. It is line skipped, but it has been some of the best 1080 footage that I've ever recorded. But when shooting 4K video, it does crop in the sensor to get the perfect 4K cutout of the sensor, and it ended up being like a 1.8 times crop. And at that point, it's really close to a micro four thirds camera. Plus, it only recorded in 8-bit internally. To record 10-bit 422, I had to grab an external recorder like this Atomos Ninja 5. And I would bring this out when I absolutely needed that extra color fidelity, but I was always worried, especially on client productions, because of the mini HDMI port on the camera. I had to use Canon's cable holder to hold my cables in place to make sure I didn't ruin the HDMI port on here. And it always just took a little bit longer to rig up, and I would either have to mount the monitor on top of the camera, or when I had my like shoulder rig, it would be in front of me, which, I would use a monitor or an EVF for that anyway, because I usually like to mount the camera on the shoulder, like directly on my shoulder, and I wouldn't be able to use it. But it just was a lot more work, and I'm typically a single person production team, and it just slowed me down. So I would actually end up using the 8-bit recording just to keep moving fast. That is to say, I did record a lot of great stuff with 8-bit color in this video. I just knew I had to nail my exposure and my color in camera because I wouldn't have a lot of latitude to push it around in post-production. This camera also recorded 120 frames per second in 720, and it lost autofocus. So not ideal for slow motion. And another weird quirk was I could record 1080 60 frames per second, but only in full frame. I could not use EFS lenses, which I often like to do because the 4K had a crop, but I could not record 60 frames per second when using these lenses, or if I wanted to punch in closer on my full frame lenses. Just a really weird quirk, but when I did pair 1080-60 with a full frame lens, I could still continue to have autofocus, and that was typically slow enough for me. I've kind of found that 60 frames per second is the sweet spot for me for slow motion versus 120 frames per second. The camera recorded in original C-Log, which, kind of gave me a little bit more dynamic range than just, full on standard or neutral color profiles, but it still wasn't a ton of latitude, like I said, in conjunction with it being 8-bit files. But even when I recorded 10-bit files with the external recorder, you know, original C-Log was just a few stops more than like wide DR on a C100. So yeah, it wasn't the most robust files for editing, but as long as I nailed it in camera, I could get really good images out of the EOS R. Plus, the video files were really easy to edit on basically any computer because they were H.264 and 8-bit 420. I could edit it in Final Cut, Premiere, DaVinci. It was fine. Pretty much any modern Intel, AMD computer could handle it. So what about the R7? The R7's a newer camera. Canon's really kind of thrown the kitchen sink into this camera in terms of video specs. It records up to 60 frames per second in 4K, although that 4K is a line skipped mode or a center crop mode. But when recording 4K at 24, 25, or 30 frames per second, it can record the full 7K sensor and then sample it down to 4K, which creates really, really sharp files. And then it can do 1080p at 120 frames per second. And it does it with autofocus. It would be great if it could do 120 at 4K, but even if it did that, then I might even be questioning owning my C70 and R5C. And it can do all of this with 10-bit 422 color in C-Log 3 with Cinema Gamut or in an HLG HDR profile. I've only used it in C-Log 3 with Cinema Gamut to match my R5C or my C70, and it matches up really well, and the files are quite robust. The only downside to this is when it is doing 10-bit 422 files, it's in an H.265 codec. That means basically only Apple's M1 or now M2 computers can edit it smoothly without needing to make proxy files. If I try to edit this on my 2018 Intel MacBook Pro, it basically just can't play the files, and then I need to convert it to ProRes, which if I'm not editing the same day, I can let it run overnight and process those files, but it's an extra step, which, you know, was kind of like the extra step of the EOS R. It was just, do I want to do the work up front and attach this to my EOS R, or do I want to transcode the H.265 files to ProRes afterward? But luckily, we've got a couple of M1 Macs here at my house, and it really doesn't matter. But if you're still editing with an x86 based computer, there aren't any graphics cards that natively decode H.265 10-bit 422 files. So which camera do I think is better? I think for the price and for like the overall feature set, the R7 really is the way to go. And if you absolutely want a full frame field of view from your lenses, you can get a speed booster from Viltrox or even Canon. Technically the Canon one is meant for the C70, but I've seen that people have mounted it on. I actually haven't put my C70 speed booster focal reducer adapter on this camera yet. Maybe I will do that and I'll play some clips. I don't think that full frame is necessary. It's all math you can take to get the same field of view and out of focus depth of fieldness of the image for a lot of scenarios. Now, it will be harder to do that with, you know, extreme wide angles and really shallow depth of field, but for a lot of the like portrait and long lens scenarios where you're not completely wide open, you can get a similar looking image. But on the flip side, if you're primarily a portrait photographer and you don't really do video and you already own a huge collection of Canon full frame lenses, EF, RF, or adapting other full frame lenses, the R is still a very respectable camera. I think for portraiture, weddings, it's not a bad camera. And for nearly the last 4 years, I've been living with the limitations of the video stuff, and it hasn't been an issue for the projects that I've done. It's just for me, being able to have much more robust color information and ease of use, there's a lot that Canon has done in the last 4 years and put into this camera. Now, I think the middle ground between these two cameras is actually the Canon R5, and it's gotten a really excellent firmware update that basically eliminated overheating. I think in terms of a photo camera, it was practically a perfect camera from the get-go, but it's been improved even on the video side as well. But that camera is basically the price of two of these R7s, and that's basically where this conversation came from. Like, these two cameras are less than $2,000. Which one would you get if I could do it again? If I could do it again, I'd probably get the R7. But that's mostly because I don't mind having an APS-C size sensor, and almost all of the other features, aside from the EVF and the LCD, are better than the R. So that's where I stand. That being said, I don't think I'm going to sell my R and replace it with an R7. I really like the R. I like that it was Canon's first full-frame mirrorless. I love just kind of the more hard edges of this camera, the serif font of the R, and the historical importance of this camera being the first full-frame mirrorless camera from Canon. But if I feel like I need another C cam to my C70 and my R5C, I would probably pick up an R7 if for whatever reason I wasn't able to use my R with the Ninja attached. You know, maybe I need 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second in 1080. That might be the reason I'd pick up an R7, but luckily my brother will probably let me borrow it or rent it from him for productions where I do need a camera with those specs. So that's it. I hope this video was informative, and if you are interested in buying an R7 or an R or any of the other cameras I use, I have affiliate links down in the description that do not make any of the cameras cost more to you, but help me continue this channel. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next time. Peace.